The phone buzzed in her back pocket, slicing through the hum of cicadas and the low chatter of villagers waiting in line. Madison Clarke, 38, stepped away from the clinic tent and into the heat, wiping her brow with a worn bandana. She glanced at the screen and froze. R. Mathers. Her breath caught in her throat. She almost let it go to voicemail. After all these years, her stepfather's name still stirred a knot of dread in her chest. But something made her answer. Hello? Madison, thought you'd want to know. I sold the mountain cabin. For a second, the world stood still. You what? I sold it, Richard repeated with casual arrogance. You're never around anyway, figured I'd put it to good use. Cleared some debts? Did everyone a favor? Madison's stomach dropped. That cabin wasn't just a piece of real estate, it was sacred ground, her safe place. Nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains, it had been her retreat after disaster zones and refugee camps, a sanctuary after grief, a second home she'd co-owned for over a decade. You had no right, she said, her voice trembling. Richard laughed. That smug, too familiar laugh. You left me in charge, sweetheart. Somebody had to make decisions. Madison gripped the phone so tightly, her knuckles turned white. What Richard didn't know, and what she hadn't reminded him of, was that the cabin wasn't solely hers to sell. Her longtime friend and co-owner, Elise, had equal legal claim. Any sale required both signatures. She ended the call and stood motionless beneath the blazing sun, heart pounding. He hadn't just crossed a line, he bulldozed over it. That night, back in her small quarters, Madison opened her journal, the one she always brought on assignment. The pages soon filled with frantic, angry writing. Her mind flashed back to her late mother's laughter, echoing through the trees, the summer she and Elise painted the cabin walls, the nights by the fire wrapped in silence and memory. It wasn't just property, it was legacy, and Richard had treated it like a poker chip. She picked up the phone again. Elise, it's Madison. We have a problem. How many things from our past, homes, traditions, relationships, are worth defending not for what they are, but for what they represent? And when someone tries to take them from us, do we still have the strength to fight back? Elise's voice came through the phone, sharp with disbelief. He sold the cabin? That's what he said. Madison paced the narrow path behind the clinic, the Arizona dust clinging to her boots. He claims it's a done deal, but I told him he can't sell something he doesn't own outright. There was a pause. Elise was a lawyer by trade and had always been the calmer of the two, but even she sounded rattled. Mad, our co-ownership agreement clearly states neither of us can sell the property without the other's written consent. If he forged something, that's fraud. Exactly. I need you to pull the documents. I'll wrap things up here and get back to Flagstaff as soon as possible. You got it, Elise replied. Let's shut this down before it gets worse. That night, while villagers gathered for a community dinner, Madison sat alone under a canvas canopy, laptop open, the flickering glow from her solar lantern casting long shadows across her tent walls. She couldn't shake the unease in her chest. Richard had always pushed limits, borrowing money he never repaid, taking control where he had no right. But this was something else. The cabin had never just been a weekend retreat. It was the only place left that still felt like her mother's presence lived on. Madison and Elise had spent years restoring it, laying reclaimed wood floors, painting the porch a soft, dusty blue. Every nail hammered, every board sanded. Those were more than just projects. They were acts of healing. Now Richard was trying to erase all of that with a handshake deal and a dirty check. The next morning, Madison received a text from Elise. Got the deed and agreement. Just as we thought, he had zero authority. No signatures, no notarized consent. I also checked with the county office. No legal sale recorded. Madison's breath released slowly. Relief mixed with rising anger. He's trying to pull a fast one, she muttered. Typical Richard. A few hours later, Elise called again, this time with a plan. I contacted the real estate office in town, spoke with an agent named Donna Matthews. She said Richard came in last week, waving a letter of authorization. but she flagged the transaction as suspicious, said it didn't add up, so the sale isn't finalized. She actually held it up? Madison asked. Yep. She said she's willing to send over what he gave her. Documents, signatures, everything. Apparently, the buyer paid a deposit, but the final funds haven't been released yet. Madison clenched her jaw. He was counting on nobody asking questions. Wrong again, Elise replied. We're not letting this go. I'm also drafting a cease and desist letter to send him and the agent, just in case he tries to sneak around us. Back inside her tent, Madison printed out every email, highlighted key phrases in the agreement, and documented every call and message. She was thousands of miles from the cabin, but her mind was already there, standing on the porch, reclaiming what was hers. This wasn't just a property dispute. It was the beginning of something bigger, a reckoning, and Richard Mathers had just picked the wrong woman to cross. The air felt heavier the moment Madison stepped out of the airport and into the Flagstaff breeze. The pine-scented wind, once comforting, now felt like a reminder of everything that had unraveled. Her phone was nearly dead, her bag slung low on her shoulder, and her heart pounded with the weight of what was waiting for her. She didn't go straight to the cabin. Instead, she drove home first, her modest townhouse just a few miles from town, where mail had stacked up, and the plants by the windowsill drooped in thirst. She didn't bother unpacking. She showered, changed into clean clothes, and sat at her kitchen table, staring at the cease and desist letter Elise had printed and left in a folder for her. Madison's hands trembled slightly as she opened her laptop. Dozens of messages blinked at her from the inbox. She ignored most of them, scanning instead for a name. Richard Mathers. And there it was. Subject, let's talk like adults. She didn't open it. Instead, she reached for her phone and called Elise. He emailed me, Madison said flatly. Of course he did. Cowards always try to look civil right before they crack. Madison let out a breath, then stood and grabbed her keys. I'm going to the cabin. The gravel crunched beneath her tires as she turned up the long, winding drive. Late afternoon light slanted through the trees, casting golden streaks across the hood of her SUV. But as the cabin came into view, a strange unease bloomed in her chest. There was a car parked outside. His car. Madison pulled in slowly, killing the engine before stepping out. She didn't slam the door. She didn't storm up the steps. She walked with the slow, steady calm of someone who already knew the truth and had nothing left to prove. Richard was sitting on the porch swing like he owned the place. He stood as she approached, flashing that same smug grin he always used to mask the rot underneath. Well, well, he said. Look who finally decided to come home. Madison didn't return the smile. Get off my property. He raised his hands mockingly. Technically our property, sweetheart. No, she snapped. Not yours. Not legally, not morally, not in any way that matters. You lied, you forged paperwork, and now you're trespassing. Richard's grin faltered. You're blowing this way out of proportion. I was trying to help. You've been gone for months, Madison. The cabin was just sitting here. I figured. You figured wrong, she interrupted, her voice low but firm. You always do. You've been scheming and manipulating for years. But this time there are consequences. She pulled the envelope from her bag and handed it to him. This is a cease and desist, prepared by Elise and our attorney. You're to stay away from this cabin, from me, from the buyer you tried to con. If you contact any of them again, we will escalate this to a criminal case. His face flushed with anger. You'd really sick the law on your own stepfather? I'd do a lot more than that, she said calmly. Don't mistake my silence over the years as weakness. That chapter of my life is over. He took a step toward her, but Madison didn't flinch. She met his eyes and held them. You're lucky I'm giving you the chance to walk away, she added, because the next time you show up here, it won't be a letter I'm handing you. It'll be a warrant. For the first time in years, Richard looked uncertain. He scoffed, muttered something under his breath, and turned to leave. She watched as he stomped down the steps, yanked open his car door, and drove off. spraying gravel in his wake. Only once the sound of his engine faded did Madison breathe again. She turned back toward the cabin. The porch swing creaked gently in the breeze. The front door was unlocked, left ajar. As she stepped inside, the familiar scent of cedar and firewood hit her like a memory. Warm, grounding. She walked through each room, taking inventory not just of what was there, but of what had almost been lost. By the time she reached the fireplace, something inside her finally cracked. Not from weakness, but from release. Madison sank into the old armchair beside the hearth and closed her eyes. She wasn't the same woman Richard used to corner with guilt. She wasn't the quiet daughter who swallowed her pain. She was done tolerating the intolerable. And if he thought she'd let this go, he'd underestimated her for the last time. By morning, the cabin no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a headquarters. Madison sat at the old kitchen table, sun streaming through the windows, papers spread in front of her like a war map. Elise had arrived just after dawn with coffee, her tote bag bulging with legal files, and a determined glint in her eyes. "You really told him to his face?" Elise asked as she set down 2 cups. "I did, and I meant every word." Madison recounted every detail of the confrontation while Elise opened her laptop. Her fingers moved fast, pulling up the scanned deed, the partnership contract, the forged sale agreement Richard had presented to the real estate office. "Unreal," Elise muttered. "He signed this alone. It's sloppy, desperate, and it's going to cost him." Madison took a sip of lukewarm coffee and leaned back, exhaustion creeping in. "It's not just the sale, Elise. It's the entitlement, the assumption that he could take something sacred and twist it for his convenience." Elise nodded without looking up. "We've already filed the cease and desist. I'm working on a supplementary notice to the buyer and the agent. Once they're fully informed, Richard will be boxed in. No more end runs." "Did you reach out to the buyer yet?" Madison asked. "Not yet. Donna, the real estate agent, said the buyer hasn't paid in full. She flagged the deal as suspicious and froze the process, thank God. But I'll follow up today." Madison stood and walked to the window, watching the wind dance through the trees. "He really thought I'd roll over?" she said quietly. "He always did," Elise replied. "But you didn't, and you won't." They worked in silence for a while, Madison sorting printed emails, Elise typing notes for the attorney. Every few minutes, a new memory would hit Madison. Her mom's laughter in the garden behind the cabin, the time she and Elise got snowed in and built a roaring fire that lasted 2 days. That house wasn't just structure, it was stitched into her soul. Later that afternoon, Elise's phone rang. "It's Donna," she said, putting the call on speaker. "Hey there," Donna's voice came through, brisk but friendly. "Got an update for you. I spoke with the buyer. He's a younger guy from Phoenix looking for a vacation rental. Turns out he had no idea the property had co-owners. He's already agreed to cancel the deal. Says he wants nothing to do with legal messes." Madison exhaled in relief. Donna continued. "Also, I've sent over the documents Richard gave me. You'll see he claimed full ownership, said his stepdaughter had signed her share over verbally. I flagged it the moment I read that. I'll cooperate however you need." "We appreciate that more than you know," Elise said. After they hung up, Madison looked down at the fake paperwork now sitting in her inbox. Richard had actually written a note in the margin of one form. "She's too busy saving the world to care about a cabin." It was the final insult. That night, Madison and Elise drafted a full case timeline. How Richard had gained access, what documents he forged, who he misled, and what laws he violated. Elise's contact, attorney Jason Menard, reviewed it and agreed they had more than enough to escalate. If Richard made one more move, it would open the door to criminal charges. They didn't have to wait long. The very next morning, Madison's phone buzzed with a new number. "Hello? Madison Clarke?" a calm voice asked. "Yes?" "This is Detective Craig Monroe with the Coconino County Sheriff's Office. I've received a referral from your attorney. I'd like to review the documents and discuss the possibility of opening a case for attempted fraud. Her breath caught, but this time from vindication. Absolutely, she said, her voice steady. I have everything you need. They arranged a meeting for later that week. After hanging up, Madison sat in silence for a moment, staring at her reflection in the cabin's dusty windowpane. Richard had always counted on her silence, on her being the peacekeeper, the fixer, the one who gave up her boundaries in the name of harmony. But now she was done handing over pieces of herself. Elise glanced up from her screen. Was that the detective? Madison nodded. He's moving forward. We're filing for formal investigation. A smile played at Elise's lips. It's happening. Madison didn't smile back. She couldn't, not yet. But her eyes, for the first time in weeks, were clear. We're not just protecting this place, she said. We're reclaiming it. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine through the air. The cabin stood firm, worn by years, but rooted in history. Madison reached out and touched the wood-paneled wall beside her, as if reassuring both the house and herself. She wasn't letting go. Not this time. 2 days after the call from Detective Monroe, Madison was standing in the middle of her kitchen, a legal pad in one hand and her phone in the other, when it buzzed again. Caller ID, Richard Mathers. She stared at the screen for a moment. She didn't owe him a second more of her time, but ignoring him wouldn't stop his tantrum. And besides, this time, she was ready. Hello? Her voice was even. You have any idea what you've done? Richard's voice came in sharp, venomous. You're ruining everything, Madison. She leaned against the counter, calm. No, Richard. I'm fixing what you tried to destroy. You've always been so ungrateful, he hissed. I stepped in when your mother couldn't handle things. I took care of her, of you. And this is how you repay me? Madison laughed bitterly. You didn't take care of anyone. You took control. You manipulated, guilt-tripped, and exploited. And now you're panicking because the one person you thought you could keep bending finally stood up. You're blowing this out of proportion, he spat. No, she said, her voice turning cold. I'm putting it into proportion. The cabin was never yours to sell. You forged documents. You lied. You used my absence as a window to commit fraud. And now the law is involved. He went silent, and for a second, she could hear the tension in his breathing. That was the sound of a man losing ground. Good luck trying to get sympathy, she added. No one's buying your story anymore. The line went dead. Madison stood there, phone still in hand, pulse steady. In the past, a conversation like that would have left her shaking. Now, it fueled her resolve. That afternoon, Elise arrived with a folder tucked under her arm. Got something for you, she said, handing it over. Detective Monroe just sent over confirmation. The buyer has formally withdrawn from the sale. The funds have been returned, and the county records have been flagged for attempted fraudulent transfer. Madison flipped through the documents. Her name and Elise's were still the only ones listed under ownership. The cabin was safe. Elise, we did it, she said, her voice cracking just slightly. Not entirely, Elise said, settling into a chair. There's still the matter of consequences. Richard didn't just try to sell it. He lied to an agent, falsified documents, and almost succeeded. Monroe wants to know, do we press charges? Madison stared out the window. The sun filtered through the pines in slanted rays, casting gold across the floorboards. He's crossed every line I ever drew, she whispered. This can't happen again. Not to me. Not to anyone. She looked back at Elise, fire returning to her eyes. Yes. Press charges. 3 days later, Madison sat across from Detective Monroe in a small conference room at the sheriff's department. Papers were spread across the table, emails, scanned documents, the fake letter of authorization Richard had provided the real estate agent. His signature stood out like a scar. You're doing the right thing, Monroe said. Fraud like this isn't just a family dispute, it's a criminal offense. People get away with this kind of thing too often because no one pushes back. Not this time, Madison said. That evening, after returning to the cabin, Madison built a fire. It was quiet, just the soft crackling of logs and the distant hoot of an owl beyond the tree line. She let the silence hold her. No anger, no fear, just space to breathe. The next morning, Monroe called again. "Wanted to give you a heads up," he said. "The DA is moving forward with charges, attempted fraudulent misrepresentation and falsification of legal documents. Richard will be served a court summons within the week." Madison nodded slowly. "Thank you, for everything." "Truthfully, most people back down when it gets this far," Monroe replied. "But you didn't." "I've spent too long being quiet," she said. "This time, I chose to speak." That afternoon, Elise came by with a bottle of champagne and two mismatched flutes from the back of her car. "To justice," she toasted. "To peace," Madison replied, clinking her glass. They sat on the porch as the sky turned amber. The cabin, once a symbol of stolen serenity, now stood solid again, because she had refused to let someone else decide its fate. As they talked, Madison reflected on everything Richard had taken over the years: her voice, her confidence, her sense of control. But now, he had nothing left to steal. And she? She had reclaimed more than a cabin. She had reclaimed herself. A week after Richard was formally charged, Madison returned to the cabin alone. There was no longer a threat hanging over it. No fear of intrusion. The legal lines had been drawn and enforced. What remained now was silence and healing. The pine trees whispered in the early fall breeze as she stepped onto the porch with a fresh bucket of paint in one hand and a toolbox in the other. Elise would arrive later with flowers for the garden, but for now, it was just Madison, the cabin, and the weight she was finally ready to set down. Inside, the old cedar walls still smelled like the past, like firewood, comfort, and every version of herself that had once sought shelter there. She ran her fingers along the windowsill, noting the peeling edges of paint, the slight creak in the floor beneath her boots. These imperfections were no longer signs of neglect. They were marks of survival. She started by repainting the porch railing, the same dusty blue she and Elise had chosen nearly 10 years earlier. With each brushstroke, the tension in her shoulders eased. Her thoughts drifted, not to Richard or court documents, but to memories that had once been too painful to touch. Her mother's laughter echoing through the halls. Elise reading aloud by lantern light during a power outage. The way the stars used to seem brighter from this very porch. Madison hadn't just fought for the legal right to this place. She'd fought for the memories it held, the parts of herself it preserved. By late afternoon, Elise showed up with gardening gloves and a flat of wildflowers. Lavender, echinacea, columbine. "I thought we could plant a little perimeter," she said, waving toward the edge of the gravel path. "Something that says, 'You're entering a space that's protected now.'" Madison smiled. "I love that." They worked in comfortable silence, digging into the cool earth, laughing when a rogue squirrel attempted to make off with one of their gloves. When the last flower was in place, they stood back and admired the transformation. "What now?" Elise asked softly, brushing dirt from her hands. Madison leaned against the porch railing, the paint now dry and gleaming in the sun. "I keep going," she said. "I keep volunteering, traveling, doing what I love. But I come back here, not to escape, but to remember who I am." Elise nodded. This place was never just about the view. It's about roots, about reclaiming something no one else had the right to touch. They stayed until the sun dipped low, bathing the hills in amber. As they sat on the porch steps with mugs of tea, Madison felt something she hadn't felt in years, peace that wasn't borrowed, but earned. Later that night, after Elise left, Madison lit a fire and sat by the hearth. She opened her journal and wrote, not about Richard or the legal case, but about renewal. She wrote about boundaries, not the ones others set, but the ones she now honored for herself. She wrote about survival, not as something she endured, but something she overcame with dignity. And finally, she wrote one sentence that carried the truth of her journey. This cabin didn't just survive the storm, it taught me how to stand in it. And with that, she closed the journal, exhaled deeply, and let herself rest. Truly rest. For the first time in years. Weeks passed, and with each quiet moment at the cabin, Madison felt more like herself. Not the version people expected, but the woman she'd fought hard to reclaim. She didn't hear much from Richard after the court proceedings were set in motion. There were no apologies, no explanations, just silence. And honestly, it was a relief. One afternoon, her mother called. "You know how he gets, Madison," her voice said, brittle with old excuses. "Maybe you don't have to take it so far." But this time, Madison didn't waver. "I do know how he gets. That's why I had to take it this far." There was no argument, just a long pause. And then, quietly, her mother said, "I hope you find peace." "I already have," Madison replied. And she meant it. Over the next few weekends, she and Elise worked side by side restoring the cabin, not because it needed to be perfect, but because the process itself was healing. They patched up the roof, added new chairs to the porch, and planted wildflowers around the perimeter, like a soft, living boundary. One evening, as the sun dipped below the treetops, Elise turned to her with a quiet smile. "So, what now?" Madison took a deep breath. The air smelled of pine and something deeper: freedom. "I live," she said, "on my terms. I keep doing what I love. But now, I come home to a place that's mine. Fully mine." Elise raised her mug. "To never shrinking again. To never handing over our peace," Madison echoed, smiling. Later that night, Madison sat alone by the fireplace, journal in hand. She didn't write about Richard or court dates. Instead, she wrote about resilience, about how long it took to realize that enduring something is not the same as being strong, and that strength, real strength, often means saying no more. The cabin had become more than a place of retreat. It was now a symbol of her quiet rebellion, her earned peace. And for the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was rooted. She was whole. She was home. In life, we often stay silent to keep the peace, especially with family. But Madison's story reminds us that peace built on silence isn't peace at all. It's a slow erosion of self-worth. After years of enduring manipulation from her stepfather, she didn't lash out with anger. She responded with clarity, dignity, and action. Her journey shows that it's never too late to reclaim what's yours, whether that's a piece of property, a long-buried boundary, or the right to say, "enough." For older adults, who may have been taught to endure rather than confront, this story offers a powerful message. Protecting your legacy is not selfish. It's wise. You've spent a lifetime building memories, values, and personal space. No one, not even family, has the right to take that from you. Whether you're defending your home, your finances, or your voice, standing firm in your truth is a form of healing. We don't grow out of our need for respect. We grow into it. Madison didn't just save her cabin, she saved herself. And sometimes, the greatest act of love we can show ourselves in later life is to finally stop shrinking for the comfort of others.